street. زي دلوقتي لو كان لي عمر أنا، وإن شاء الله المصريين لهم العمر، نيجي ونفتتح المرحلة ديت ونعبر في القناة الجديدة 35 كيلو.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome here in the studio Ambassador Mohamed, a member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Let me start off, obviously, by asking you what you think of the status quo in Yemen, and can we comfortably describe it as a coup?
Yes, it's a coup in a situation of chaos. The whole formula of the Yemeni state, as we know it, seems to have collapsed.
Right.
And this takes us back to a state that has had many, many years, decades of instability. It's gone through a long evolutionary process since the 1960s. And sadly, it has not coalesced around a political system that is viable. It has not managed to reconstruct and reform. It has not managed to integrate the different factions of this state into one entity. So we have a very serious situation because first, the level of violence in the country, the impact that this has on neighboring countries, serious strategic issues like security of the Red Sea, the entrance to the Red Sea, and also the regional conflict between different powers, middle-sized powers in this region, that is reflected in Yemen. So we have a very explosive situation.
Why do you think that all of a sudden the Houthis decided to take over the country, though?
The Houthis have a history in Yemen at the very center of politics.
Right.
This was the backbone of the old Imamate regime. And so they are big stakeholders. What is surprising is not the fact that they have sought to cease fire. The surprising thing is how fast the Yemeni state collapsed. And the question here is, do we see a pattern in the way states in this region seem to have lost their capacity to stay in power? Because it's a pattern that we see repeated in one state after the other. So it's less surprising that they have gone this far. Of course, there are a lot of reasons for dissent. The way wealth and power and decision-making is distributed.
Right.
The lateness of the process of reform. Many of the countries we've seen in the Arab Spring really were very late about changing their government regimes. Right. They didn't want to adapt. They were very rigid. It's interesting that they're all republics. We have not seen this in monarchies. It's interesting that these are regimes that have, at one time or another, raised nationalist and socialist slogans. It's interesting that they have ended up being regimes backed by the military, one-person regimes trying to pass on authority to their sons.
Right.
And so all of these characteristics together mean that what we had before was not that great.
But I guess it also raises the questions what they have to gain from this power grab and who is backing them.
Yes, they want to gain a say in power in the country. They probably realize that they cannot govern alone, but they want to govern on their terms.
Right.
The danger here is that the Yemen, as we've known it in the last few decades, can disintegrate because the south will have nothing to do with the Houthis, so there immediately you have one fault line. And then you have other tribes, and perhaps this is an issue that many people do not follow very closely. You have a lot of other tribes that do not see eye to the Houthis and would resist the Houthis.
Right.
And you still have the remnants of the old state, military units, governors, political figures, who will continue to resist the Houthis. So you have, all in all, a formula for a civil war.
Right. And the thing is now that we understand the latest statement from the Houthis is that they said that they denounced as quote-unquote provocative blackmail and demands for them to relinquish power. Now, how do you see a way out of this? Are we talking about negotiations continuing? Because so far, political parties are sitting down, but then they don't like what the Houthis have to offer, and they leave, so to speak. So how do you find a way out of the status quo?
Well, in the short term, what you'll be seeing in a few hours now is going to be a Security Council resolution. There has been a very clear declaration from the Gulf Cooperation Council on this, refusing the takeover of the Houthis and making demands on them, and calling for the release of the former president and a whole list of issues. Without force, it's very difficult to see how these things can be implemented.
Right.
So to be realistic...
Are you expecting military intervention?
I don't see military intervention.
Right.
People have had their fingers burnt in Yemen before. It's a very complex situation. Nobody wants to touch it. So what you see is much more closer to a chaotic situation that can last for some time. You can see a split with the South. You can see resistance. You can see civil war. Yes, there are international or at least regional powers that have taken sides on this. This in itself makes it more difficult to reach a negotiated settlement. Eventually, perhaps after a longer time, you may see a political settlement of sorts.
Okay. To what extent, though, does Yemen and an unrest in or a disturbed Yemen going to affect its neighbors directly?
The history has told us that Yemen instability has an impact on neighboring countries.
Right.
If you go back to as I said, the first Yemeni revolution and the Egyptian intervention in Yemen and the confrontation with Saudi Arabia, there is a whole history there where regional powers were sucked into a very bitter and difficult conflict.
Right.
You also had the conflict in Dhofar. People forget now that the conflict in Dhofar with Oman was also an offshoot of the situation in Yemen. So there are complications there. What has added to it also now is people are talking about Bab el-Mandab and the security of the Red Sea, and of course in a context of instability related to the situation in Somalia, just across the Gulf of Aden. So you have a lot of issues that can involve neighboring countries and impact on their security. It is possible to contain it to some extent. I don't see it that it's an immediate possibility for an explosion, but of course it is worrying in the longer term.
Okay, well, recently Prime Minister Ibrahim Mohamed said that Egypt would never allow the Houthi militants to close the Bab el-Mandab Strait. Could the situation in Yemen have any consequences on us here in Egypt, and what sort of action, because he spoke that Egypt would immediately act in case anything of the sort does happen. So what kind of consequences, what kind of action do you think Egypt might be willing to take?
I wouldn't expect the Houthis to be foolish enough to do something like that. Having said that, there is a need to review Egypt's security policy in the Red Sea, and that relates to a lot of complex factors. It relates to relations with the countries around the Red Sea. It relates to the issue of Somali pirates. It relates to the issue of the International Maritime Force that helps patrol the sea lanes affected by Somali pirates, and there had been an invitation for Egypt to join in this force.
Right.
So I think all of these positions need to be reviewed and a comprehensive strategy developed. I wouldn't jump to the conclusion of an Egyptian intervention. I don't think that this is the right moment for this, and I don't think the capacity is there.
Well, what does the unrest being witnessed in Yemen mean for Al-Qaeda in the country?
Al-Qaeda is one of the actors, one of the competitors. This incident in France, Charlie Hebdo, was related to the Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Yemen.
Yeah.
So it is one of the actors there. It is one of the key forces that use terrorism to further its aims, and this has caused an international intervention led by the United States to conduct surgical strikes against Al-Qaeda in Yemen in cooperation with the Yemen authorities. This has now collapsed. This system of trying to contain Qaeda has collapsed. There has been a withdrawal of the American presence, the embassies.
But I understand that some members of the CIA are still in Yemen, and also that the drone strikes are continuing.
Difficult to say this.
Right.
There are other reports that all the U.S. staff have been withdrawn, and that the cooperation, at least with the Yemen authorities on this issue, has been rescinded. Whether the strikes continue without cooperation with Yemen, that's also a possibility. It has happened in other countries. This is not new.
Is there a possibility, though, that the Americans could start, if the Houthis do gain control of Yemen as legitimate leaders of the country, do you think that the U.S. would then start negotiating with them to obviously bring down Al-Qaeda in the country?
The possibilities of using negotiations will definitely there, not only the Americans but other parties.
Right.
Because at one point this may come. We are not at this moment now.
Right.
The moment now is much more a moment of refusing what the Houthis have done, asking them to rescind the steps that they have taken, asking them to return the arms that they have taken from the Yemeni army, to release the Yemeni president. All of these demands on the Houthis push you towards more of a confrontation rather than a negotiated settlement. Whether this will work or not, is the jury's out. In the longer term, all scenarios are possible, including negotiations with the Houthis, provided they create a model of government that is open to other forces, is humane, and stands away from the excesses we've seen of the likes of Daesh and so on.
Right, but given their history, do you think that they're capable of what you are mentioning now?
They would need a big transformation. It's not evident immediately. It is a possibility. The other thing is, of course, the world now is very much focused on the Daesh issue. It would be difficult to take energy and resources away from that to use them, particularly militarily, in the Yemen.
Right. Let me also ask you, I mean, obviously Washington spent more than a decade helping the Yemeni government build up its counter-terrorism capabilities, but what we're seeing now, does that necessarily mean that the